Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the semifinal match in Division 1 between the five-time world champion, Magnus Carlsen, and one of the great players in chess history, Levon Aronian. Now, neither player needs an introduction. They've been playing lots of chess over the past 2 decades, some of the highest ratings in history, and now they're competing in the Julius Baer Generations Cup. Now, the match format, same as always. They're playing 4 games of 10-minute with a 2-second increment. The winner will move on to the final of Division 1. So, 4-game match. In game number 1, Magnus and Levon drew in that game. Magnus having the white pieces, Levon with the black piece. There was one moment when Magnus made a huge blunder and could have lost the game, but it did end in a draw. So, first game's a draw, and now in the second game, Levon with the white pieces, Magnus with the black pieces, and let's dive right into the action. So we get the move e3 being played. Magnus goes knight to f6, and now we get knight f3. Now, e3 is definitely a kind of unusual move to start with, but Levon probably plays this to try to protect against some move like c5, where he can go d4 maybe right away, or maybe it's e5, d4. I'm not really sure, but he goes with e3. We get knight f6, knight f3, and now we have the move g6. We get b4, e6, a3, bishop g7, and now we have the move bishop e2. Magnus castles, we get c4, b6, knight c3, c5, and now we have d4. Knight c6 is played, we get bishop to e2, and Magnus plays d5, trying to strike in the center right away. Now, there are a lot of pawns here in the center of the board. The pawns on d4, c4, and b4. Black has pawns on d5 and c5, so it is a very chaotic position. We get castles, Magnus takes, we get takes, bishop b7, and now we have the move rook fd1. Here, Magnus plays the move knight to e4, discovering the queen on this diagonal for the fianchettoed bishop on g7, and he's probably thinking, I'm a little bit better here. Now, Levon with the white pieces decides to sack the queen by playing queen takes bishop on g7, and this is a very aggressive move. Now, one of the funny things is that I was actually covering this game on my Kick channel, and some alarm bells went off in my head after takes, and f6. And this position, in fact, is very close to a mirror of a game that I had many, many years ago in the 2009 U.S. Chess Championship against Jan Elvis. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's go back to the very start of the game and flip the colors. So I had a game against Jan Elvis, which went something like this: e6, b3, d5, g3, c5, bishop g2, knight c6 castles, b6, bishop b2, bishop b7, e3, bishop e7, takes, knight c3, castles, takes, d5, or d4, I should say. And in that game, I played rook a d8. We got knight e5. I sacked the queen. And after f3, I was a little bit worse in this position with the black piece. Now, it's very, very similar to the game, except the colors are flipped in this position. The only difference is the pawns are on b7 and a6, b6 and a7 versus b5 and a6. And I have the rooks on f8 and d8 versus having the rooks on d8 and a8. So very, very similar to my game against Jan Elvis. And I remember back when I played that game, looking at it afterwards with the computer, I was surprised at just how bad it is, even though you have the 2 pieces in return for the queen. But it does show how, at the end of the day, the queen is the most powerful piece in this great game that we call chess. So, all right, back to the Levon Magnus game. We get the queen sack here. We get takes, f6 being played. And now Levon takes on d5. Magnus takes back with a pawn, and we get to move knight to g5, queen to e7, and knight to f3. Now, what Levon is trying to do is that he's trying to set up a bastion here with the knight on d4. And after bishop c6, bishop a6, he's assuming that with the knight covering the squares here, let's just go back one move, knight covering c2, bishop covering c3, the rook cannot infiltrate. So even though black has an extra queen, the knight and the bishop can maybe target the pawn. You got the 2 Bs on the diagonals. And as long as there's no entry, you should be okay. But as I said before, a queen is a queen, and a queen is worth 9 points in the game of chess. So it is extremely powerful. So we get bishop a6. Magnus goes bishop a4. We get bishop takes rook. And now we get rook takes bishop. Now, what Magnus has done here is he sacked the rook for a bishop. But in return, if white were to play rook c1, now you can play the move rook to c4. You have your own bastion for the rook on the square. You cover the d1 square. And even though materially it's much closer than it was prior to the sacrifice of the rook, white is actually much worse here in this position. You can also go like queen e4, queen d3. The queen is getting in, you're activating, and white really has very, very passive pieces on the queen side. And the queen obviously can go any which way she likes. So after rook takes c8, we get rook to d2. Magnus plays rook c4, and now we have the move h3 being played. Magnus plays king to f7. Important, by the way, because if you were to go queen c7 immediately, it's spaghetti time as I start jumping with the horse, and I fork the king and the queen. So we get king f7. Rook e1 is played here, and now Magnus goes a5. What Magnus is trying to do here is open up this queen side, because after takes, now you have a weakness on a3. The queen is always spying it, on top of ideas like queen e4 or queen b7. Here we get the move f3 from Levon, and now Magnus plays the move queen c7, trying to protect the c file. We get the move rook f2, and now we have h5 being played, rook e2, h4, and now f4. Now, what Magnus is doing here is he's just slowly trying to improve the position. He's trying to take a little bit more space with the pawn on h4 so that white can't really push p on the king side. And eventually his plan is to maybe go bishop d1, maybe bishop c2, maybe eventually push the pawn to a4. But he has all the time in the world to wait. And for that reason, there is literally no rush. So we get f4. Magnus now goes queen back to e7. And Levon has kind of blinked a little bit here because now the e4 square is available for the queen since white has pushed f4. Levon goes king to h2. We get queen to e4. And now we have the move rook back to e1. Magnus goes queen to d3. And now we get the move rook f e2. And we have bishop d7. Another point that I'd like to make here is you're probably looking at the position thinking, well, the bishop guards the pawn, bishop guards the knight. There's no infiltration on the c file, so white might have a fortress. Now, famously, I believe it was in 2016 when Magnus Carlsen played a world championship match against Sergei Karyakin. He coined this great phrase that he simply does not believe in fortresses, or fortresses do not exist. Now, in my life, having traveled the world, I've seen a lot of great fortresses around the world, so I would beg to differ with Magnus to some degree. But in this case, Magnus is probably right that such a fortress doesn't exist. So we get rook f2. Now we have bishop to f5 being played. Here we get knight takes bishop, and Magnus takes on f5. Levon goes rook to d2. Now we get rook to c2, and we have rook e d1. We get king to e6. Bishop d4 is played, and now Magnus goes a4. Now we've had a little bit of a transition here with the knight for the bishop coming off the board. And you're thinking, well, now white has a wooden shield, right? You've got a great wooden shield in the middle of the board. Your rooks are well placed on the d file. Black can't really do a whole lot here on the king side, so you should be fine. However, you have this weak pawn on a4. Black can start to use the king as an active piece, and it's still quite difficult to play. We get king g1. Magnus plays g5. We get takes, and now we have king h2 back. For Levon, this is a situation where he's simply going to try to sit on the position here. If he were able to get a position like this, for example, just to illustrate it, something like let's just say something like this, for example, white is probably very close to being completely fine here because you have the wooden shield, the bishop guards the rook, and white does not have many weaknesses. So we get queen to e4, we get takes, and now Levon plays the move rook f1. Keep in mind in this position, because there are pawns on both sides of the board with the a pawns here, it's not simply a draw. Now, if you could magically get a position, let me just set this up, something like, I don't know, like this, for example, this would be an easy draw here for white in this position because black has no ways to target anything on the queen side. It's a barren wasteland over here on the queen side. There are no pawns or no pieces. With the wooden shield stuck on d4 forever and the rook on the f file, it's an easy draw. It's also worth pointing out that in endgames, generally, you want to keep pawns on both sides of the board. You want to try to create multiple weaknesses. You know, it's like when you think about history. Wars were not won and lost based off of one weakness. You had to have one flank on the west, one flank on the east. You know, you think back to World War II. You think about I don't even know why I'm going off on that tangent. You have to go after multiple weaknesses. One weakness is generally not enough to win the game. So for Magnus here, he's trying to create the weaknesses on both sides. And Levon plays the move rook to f6 here. We get king to e7. Now we have the move rook to h6. And here, Magnus takes the pawn on a3. Now we get rook to g6. We have queen to b3. And Levon takes the pawn on g5. Now, at this point, Levon's king is very safe on the king side. Use a 2v1. No issues here. But black does have this outside a pawn that he's going to push up the board. So here we got the move a3. Now we have rook to g4. We got queen to b8 check, king g1. And Magnus plays the move a2. Now, it's very interesting here that Levon plays the move rook to f4 because I'm not actually 100% sure. I guess actually I am 100% sure. I was thinking rook takes h4 might not be losing in this endgame after queen takes, and rook to d4 trying to set up a fortress. It feels very difficult, but I'm not 100% sure whether this is actually losing. My instinct is that probably it is somehow, but it's not completely concrete. Instead, Levon goes rook to f4 here. His idea is to play rook to f1 and then cover the a1 square. We get check, rook f1, and now Magnus plays king d6. Here we get king f2, king c6, rook to e1, and now after king to b5, I believe that Levon Aronian simply flags on time here and loses the game. Now, you'll notice from the evaluation bar that black is actually not winning here. White can survive this position if white plays a move like rook to f1, because after king c4, if you go king g1, king d3, king f2, king d2, very important here that you do not play king g1, because then king to e2 would win the games. I threaten to win your rook, and if you take my queen, I get a new queen, and now it's a queen versus bishop. Obviously, a wooden shield is no comparison compared to a queen. So this would actually be very close to a draw here because white can now play the move bishop to g7 and start yo-yoing with the bishop back and forth. A check, king g1, queen d3. Now you go bishop d4, and with the wooden shield to do the yo-yo ma, the rook on f1 covering the square, and the lack of material on the king side, it should be a draw. But Levon ends up flagging, which really is a great tragedy in this position after king to b5, because it means that he now goes down in the match by a score of 1.5 to half. Now, the players would draw in game number 3, which takes us to the fourth and final game of the match, where if Levon Aronian does not beat Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces, he will lose the match and be in the loser's bracket in Division 1. So, Levon with the white pieces, he's got to try and win the game. So here we get the move e4. Magnus plays e5, knight f3, knight c6. We get bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, and now we have knight f6. Levon plays d3, and here we get the move h6. Now, this, of course, is the classic Gucci piano opening. It's existed for something like 600 years. One of the two most common openings alongside the Spanish or the Ruy Lopez. Now, with Magnus playing h6 here, bro thinks he is Hikaru. Those of you guys who have been following Hikaru's games that he played in the Candidates and Norway chess, Hikaru played this move h6 against Alireza Firouzja in both the Candidates, the game he won, as well as in the game in Norway chess, which ended in a draw and cost him a shot at winning the tournament. So, bro thinks he's Hikaru here when he plays h6, but now Levon plays move h3. Now, Alireza Firouzja played b4, bishop e7, queen b3, castles, and I believe he played the move a4 here. Both those games against Hikaru were very sharp and double-edged, but Levon has a different idea in mind, which is, of course, to play the move h3. Now, to differentiate between the variations, by the way, just to point this out, this line with d3 and c3 is what we call the Gucci pianissimo in Italiano. And when you do play the Gucci pianissimo, generally, it's supposed to be a very slow line. You're playing for a very long game. It's just not something where you're very aggressive at the start. So we get knight d2, a6, a4. Now we get bishop a7. Now we have bishop b3. And here Magnus plays knight e7. Now it's worth pointing out that in some Spanishes, as well as in the Italian, if both sides have played h3 and h6, you have to be very careful when you decide to castle. Because if black were to castle here, white can potentially play g4, rook g1, and g5, immediately attacking on the king side. And the same is true for white. Let's just say I play queen e7 and you castle. Now black can go g5, g4, and immediately white is in all kinds of trouble. So you're playing the Spanish or the Gucci piano. You always have to be aware of these situations. You always have to be aware of these situations where the pawns are on h3 or h6, and whether your opponent can push p with g4 or g5, depending on which side has castled. So Magnus plays knight e7. Now we get knight to f1, knight g6, knight g3. And now that both sides have put these knights on f3, g3, and f6 and g6, there are no ideas of pushing p on the king side. So now both sides harmonize and they castle on the king side. We get d5 played here by Magnus, trying to chip away at the white center here. Knights guard d5 and e5 here from being captured. And Levon plays pawn takes pawn. We get takes, rook e1, and now Magnus plays this move c6. Now, this is a very critical move to reinforce the horse on d5. If you were to play the move rook to e8, trying to guard the pawn on e5 immediately, now white can play the move d4, and suddenly you have all kinds of problems. Your pawn on e5 is under attack by the knight, the pawn, and the rook. And if you try to take the pawn, I trade the towers, and suddenly you lose the knight on d5, and with it, you resign the game. So Magnus plays c6 instead, and now we get the move d4. Worth pointing out, of course, if white were to try to grab this pawn at e5, this would be a severe mistake because I can trade the horses. And now I sack the bishop with bishop takes pawn, checking the king and attacking the knight. And if you take the bishop, now I have queen to f6, checking the king and winning the rook on e5. And black simply is ahead in material. So we get d4 from Levon. Magnus decides to trade the pawns on d4, and now he goes rook to e8. Levon plays rook takes rook. We get takes, and now we have bishop takes knight. Now, what Aronian is doing here is he's trying to create the classic isolani, or the isolated pawn on d5. As you can see, chess is a very rich game. A lot of these great terms that have been invented over the last 4 years. You have this isolated pawn on d5, and white wants to try to go after it. On the flip side, black has the two Bs here, the bishop combination. So black is only very minorly worse. We get bishop e3, bishop d7 played by Magnus. Now we have the move queen to b3 here. What Levon is trying to do is he's trying to press both the pawns on d5 and b7 at the same time. Magnus goes bishop to c6, guarding the pawns on d5 and b7. And now we get the move knight gf5. Magnus goes queen to d7 here, spying the knight on f5, guarding the pawn on b7 and the bishop on c6. And now we get queen c2. Magnus goes rook to e8, bringing the last piece into the game on the open e-file. And here we get a huge mistake from Levon Aronian with knight f3. Now, one of the things that's very difficult is that when you're playing Rapid and Blitz, there's certain moments in the game when you want to try to push your opponent around on the clock. You want to bully them into blundering. And this is one situation where when you look at the time, Levon is up nearly 3 minutes. Black is the isolated pawn here. It feels like a good time to try and do that. So Levon plays knight f3, but in fact, this move is a very serious mistake. But on the flip side, with Magnus only having 4.5 minutes, maybe he will miss the correct continuation. And in fact, Magnus does, because he plays the move bishop takes e3 after a 30-second think. When the move d4, sacrificing a pawn but opening up the scopes for both of D's bishops would have been extremely strong. If white takes back with a knight, you take, and after knight d4, knight h4, all of a sudden white's kingside pawns are extremely loose here, and white cannot play f3 to stop the threat, because then you lose the bishop and the game. So if you take on c6 after queen c6, you still can't push the g-pawn. Queen g2 is checkmate here, and you lose the game. And I guess the best thing to do after knight h4 is apparently queen e2. But after knight g2, queen g4, takes. I guess you take, and rook e4. Black, and maybe black's not actually winning here, but with black having all these pawns on the king side, black will get great chances. However, Magnus does not have all the time in the world. If he had 20 minutes, I'm sure he would find the tactic. But with only 4 minutes, he decides to trade the Bs. Now he goes for the move knight to f4 here, putting his own knife towards the pawns on g2 and h3. But Levon plays knight d4, blocking any threats for the scope on c6. Magnus goes rook e4, we get queen d1, and now the move queen e7 is played. Now, one thing that's very important to note is even if Magnus is down on time here, he does not have a lot of options. His ideas are quite simple. He wants to bring the queen to either g5, f6, or e5. He wants to leave the rook on e4 where it attacks the knights and the pawns potentially, and he wants to leave the knight on f4. So even though Magnus is down a lot of time on the clock here, it's not that difficult to play because he doesn't have 20 different moves to consider. So we get queen f3, Magnus goes bishop d7 here. Now the knife on f4 guards the pawn from being captured, and the bishop and the knight are both spying the pawns on h3 and g2. We get the move king h1, Magnus plays queen e5, and now we have the move b3 being played. Now, what Levon would love to do is he'd love to bring the tower into the game. Now, one thing we always say to beginners who play chess is you want to develop your piece, and you're probably going, well, look at this guy, Levon Aroni, look at Magnus Carlsen. These guys, they don't develop pieces. What are they doing? They don't know the fundamentals. But of course, that is one of the great allures of playing chess, is that at the end of the day, there are many situations where you learn what the rules are, and then you learn when you can break them. It's very similar to the Matrix, of course, exact same thing. So here we got the move b3. Now Magnus plays knight to d3, and we get the move knight to g4 here, and this move is simply a mistake. However, having said that, the best move in the position is to play knight e to c2, because now you guard the knight on d4, but you also target the knight on d3. And more importantly, if you were to play just a quiet move like rook to b1, you would actually lose to rook f4 here, attacking the queen, because if you ever move the queen, you lose the pawn on f2, and then you lose the game. So if you go knight c2, now your knights are reinforced here. They're reinforcing each other. The queen targets the horse on d3, and additionally, the knight on c2 stops black from infiltrating with rook e1. But instead, Levon goes knight g4, and this is actually a big mistake because now Magnus plays rook e1 check. White has to take. He can't go to h2 because of the queen. You get swap, king h2, and now the move queen takes c3 is played, where the queen guards the knight from being captured, but it also targets the white knight on d4. Levon plays queen e3. We got bishop takes knight, pawn takes. And now we have the move queen c7, breaking the pin. We got g3, knight e5. And at this point, Magnus is now simply up a pawn on d5 in an endgame. He is never going to lose this position. We get king h3, knight c6 is played. For Magnus, I also like this decision, even if the computer hates it, because what you're trying to do here is you're trying to draw the game. Remember, because of Magnus's win in the second game, he's winning the match, and a draw is sufficient to advance. And sometimes it's more important than trying to go for broke and win a game where maybe you take some extra risk and something horrible happens. We get check, king h7, knight f5 here. Magnus goes d4, and now we get knight takes pawn. Temporarily, of course, Levon is sacking the horse, but after takes and queen e4 check, you hit the king and win the knight. Magnus goes g6, we got queen takes knight, and now we have the move queen c6, threatening the very nasty idea of queen to h1, checkmating the king in the corner. We get king h2, queen f3 played here by Magnus. Great positioning of the queen, by the way. It's the classic 90-degree right triangle here. The queen guards both the pawns on b7 and f7. It also hits the pawn on b3, so we have two right triangles in here, as well as a square box. So this queen is perfectly placed for Magnus, and now Levon goes b4. Here we go queen to c6. Levon plays a5, and now we get queen back to f3. Magnus is more than content to leave the queen on the square, because it just simply guards everything and targets all of white's pieces at the same time. Levon plays king g1, we get king to g8, and now we have the move king f1. Magnus goes back, we get king e2, and now we get a bunch of checkies, back and forth, And eventually, Magnus plays move b6. Levon goes queen c4. We get check, king c3, takes, and now the move queen b7 is played. Now, this, of course, another great example of how strong the queen can be. It guards f7 and a6. It also covers the b file, so the white king cannot enter. We get king c2. Now we have the move king g8, queen c5, queen e4, king c3, and here Magnus plays the move queen e1. Now, Magnus could have taken the pawn on g4 here because queen c8 check would be a classic Botez gambit. You do create the classic 90-degree right triangle, but at the same time, you hang your queen and you resign the game. So we get queen e1 check instead. We have king c4. We get a bunch of checkies again, and eventually we're going to have this king wandering back towards the king side. So we end up in this position after king to d4, where Levon essentially sacrifices the pawn on g3, and Magnus, it plays the move queen b4. Now, Magnus could take the pawn on g3 once again, but I think at this point, Magnus is basically saying, look, I'm going to make the draw, and you're going to have to take the draw. I know that I can maybe play for more, but I want to draw, and so it's going to be a draw. It's like the classic phrase where it's saying something like, there's a saying where it's something like, you want me to stream 10 hours, or you want me to stream 10 hours. I'll give you 10 hours. You want me to stream 20 hours. I'll give you 10 hours. It's the same kind of thing. Maybe that's the wrong analogy, but there's something where it's like, I'll do this, and I'll do this no matter what. So Magnus is basically saying, I'm going to make this a draw whether you like it or not. We get king d3, check, queen c3, more checks all over the board, and here we get the move queen takes g4. Now, at this point, Magnus is kind of forced to do it. I guess he isn't. He could still play queen b3, but I think he gets fed up of Levon's antics, and he just simply decides, you know what? I'm going to take the pawn, and that's life. So we got king f2, guarding the pawn. Magnus is up a pawn here. It's probably not cleanly winning for black, but at the end of the day, there's also no risk. We get queen e6, check, king g7, and now queen b2, queen f6, and we have the move queen b6 being played. Now, what Levon is hoping for is that Magnus will want to trade queens, but if he trades queens, then I get a new queen, and I win the game. So, of course, Magnus is never going to trade his queen away, and he plays the move g5 instead. Levon goes king f3, and now we get this move h5 being played. What Magnus is trying to do is he's trying to get rid of these pawns on the king side. At the moment, temporarily, the king on f3 is kind of shielded by the pawns. So if you can just liquidate all these pawns on the king side, there will be no shield for the king to survive. So here we get the move king e4. Now we have takes, and Magnus plays queen e6. Obviously, white can never trade the queens here because now black has 3 pawns. You have 3 pawns versus 2, and black will win the game. So we get king f3. Magnus goes queen g4, we get king e3, and Magnus decides to play this move queen e6. If Magnus needed to win this game, however, he could have played on with check, king e2, and queen g6 here. And after king to f3, now black can maybe play h4 here. And it's very, very scary for white. Black is pushing this h-pawn up the board. Maybe it's not winning on the spot, but I would bet you good money that Magnus would win this game. Instead, Magnus, as I said earlier, is more than content to make a draw, and he simply decides to force the repetition here, and the game ends peacefully in a draw. And with that, Magnus Carlsen wins his semifinal match against Levon Aronian, and he will move on to the grand finals. I'm not grand finals, but he will move on to the finals of the winner's bracket, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So we will obviously take a look at that match when he plays it either tomorrow or the following day. So Magnus proves once again how strong he is. Levon had some moments where maybe he could have done something, but Magnus is simply too OP in this match, and he moves on. All right, so on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the semifinals of the Julius Baer Generations Cup, which is part of the Chess Champions Tour and being held on chess.com. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great recaps as Magnus continues to torch the field in this event. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you soon. Bye.